Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to be in the first hybrid event, and so we're trying to get the energy here and channel that to the people on live stream. So welcome. Again, we have a lot of different things to talk about, Carrie and I. I think so many topics have come up. One is that we want to discuss is the Green Software Foundation. How can the IT industry become more sustainable by itself? There's also other issues. We heard about skilling up, jobs changing in the workforce. What are the Gen Z and millennials going to do as they look for new jobs after the Great Resignation? What are large corporates going to do, and what are companies that Carrie represents, Implus and others? What are they planning to do in sustainability? So lots of different things to talk about. But I want to start first with software being developed. Again, one of the things that we've encountered over time is software is easy to develop, but at the same time, software has to be more efficient, i.e. compute power has to be looked into, storage has to be looked into. It's so easy now. We just go on Apple and buy a terabyte of storage. Do we really think and understand what the implications are for each one of us as we continue to store data? Or we write software and the software makes 100 calls as opposed to 1 or 2 calls to the database, or the compute itself is more efficient, right? And so Microsoft and many others have started something called the Green Software Foundation. It's something I'd urge all of you to look into. So they're looking at standards that make development of software more sustainable. Also, hardware and other services need to be more sustainable, more efficient. And also the people who are developers. Today everybody's a developer. There's low code and no code platforms. Everybody's developing software. So we got to bring that idea of sustainability into any kind of software we develop. So Carrie, any thoughts on that element?
I think it's one of the things that we underestimate how important these types of initiatives are. When we talk about a lot of new workers today, they're looking to not only see this type of leadership, but then be able to contribute to it. The initiative you're speaking to, as well as many others, these are coders, these are practitioners in the field that need to know that it exists, actually be able to implement it, also be able to interplay with it. And a lot of the new type of sustainability initiatives aren't just leaders from on high pushing down, different types of practices, but instead bringing everyone that has to touch it into these types of engagements.
And that goes to the next generation. The Great Resignation has now translated into trying to hire millions of, I think the US has 11 million open job postings today. 11 million. Who's going to fill those positions, right? And the Gen Z and millennial crowd is looking at companies and jobs very differently than people like me did when we joined the company. They look for sustainability initiatives of the company. They look for companies to be purpose-driven. So many things. Talk to us a little bit about that, what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, I've been working with a lot of young people in not just my job, but also just as pro bono activities for the last 10 years, especially. With a number of university students and young generation talent coming into the field, I hear constantly, you can't buy time. They've learned from their parents that time is the greatest currency to them. So where they spend their time, who they spend their time with matters. Collaboration on purpose-driven activities, collaboration with mentors, opportunities to get in the field. How their day-to-day impacts the world is really what they're looking for. So even if there's someone that is entirely in data analytics that doesn't have an ESG background, you give them 5 to 10% of their time that they get to even touch that, all of a sudden they stick around for 3 more years. All of a sudden they take that job. And I see it consistently across any field. Give them the time to work on things that matter, even if it's just a smaller percentage, and they'll stick around or take that job.
Yeah, and that's the big difference between the previous generation of IT workforce and today is, in the old days, we would look at a resume, and if anyone had less than 5 years of experience in a company, we would kind of go, what's wrong with this person, right? Now, the average resume you get is 6 months to 18 months,
18 months.
In any position. So things have changed dramatically. And as a lot of you here in the audience are CEOs of companies, VPs of engineering, same thing on the live stream. You're hiring a lot of people. I think the biggest thing now is to not only attract your audience, your workforce, but to retain them for more than 6 to 12 months. I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. But I think if you kind of set principles in place of efficient software coding, storage, compute power, and the like, people are now even asking today, if I'm watching Netflix, what does watching 1 minute of Netflix mean to sustainability? Right?
It's, I was part of the World Economic Forum's blockchain coding activities and how to actually move towards a lower carbon footprint, the coding practices, and then also how do you use that product. So it's two ways. It's what you're doing with the product, whether it be software, hardware, other physical goods, and then what it does for society. And so it's something that I have found. I do work as a policy plus practitioner kind of engagement in any company I work in. And one of the things that I have found most successful to create talent both in my organization as well as others is that matching of a practitioner on whatever it could be. It could be software, but it could also be someone working on the policy, working on the sales. Have them work together on solution sets, not just bring in this person at the end of the game. I know this is old school kind of organizational behavior, but it really does matter for that kind of positive, purpose-driven person to see that they have influence and they can collaborate on multiple types of projects, particularly in the ESG space.
Yeah, and let's talk about ESG. That's become a new cry within the market space, within public companies, but now also gravitating to private companies, even startups. Investors are starting to look at what is your ESG footprint and what are your requirements? Are you satisfying those? Talk to us a little bit about that, how this has moved from public company investment to actually in the private sector as well.
Absolutely. I really got a lot of my footing when I was at Apple, and I was part of the first 5 years of their SEC filing for conflict minerals. With that kind of experience, I got the big corporate, big, impact, every word matters and it has to be audited down to a T for that ESG space. But even with small startups, I've worked across the board at this point, and investors, large and small, are asking, what is your impact, both for your product, your corporate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as then what your overall purpose will be for this program. And so when we look at something like M+, we're looking at everything from repair and return opportunities to where the product is made and anti-money laundering issues and other things that could happen in the supply chain, and then all the way to the DEI space.
Yeah, and so, Sanjay just did a keynote on AI. That could be used, again, in this form to check companies, but also blockchain is another important element in identifying things in the supply chain, are what they are deemed to be and certified to be, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
all that is going to come in.
And I'm sure we could talk a long time about your experience with this. And with Everledger, I did a lot of work on how do we start using technology and software for the good. I have had teams of people working on very manual efforts to grab different types of documents, read different types of documents, and then be able to interpret them and then bring them back for policy planners to start, enacting. But I would love to know a little bit more about, our back and forth and how you see this working in manufacturing, sustainable design, and other activities in terms of what you've done before.
Yeah. So at the Corporate Eco Forum, we're a membership group of about 70 of the world's largest companies. And the chief sustainability officers are the sponsors who come together to kind of identify what they need to do to make the world a better place, right? Because we feel moving the needle in the corporate space, these companies represent about 5 trillion in combined revenues. So even moving the needle 1 or 2% on any activity really sends a demand signal to the market. And so they're looking at it many different ways. One is obviously overall footprint. What is your greenhouse gas footprint? How can we reduce those? And the many ways to do that, obviously, right? The second thing is also to increase renewable energy purchases. Simultaneously, you have to also send a signal that you're buying more renewable energy. Because initially in the days of cloud computing, for those of you here and on live stream, cloud computing, initially, there was a Greenpeace report, I think like 10 years ago, that said, the cloud is dirty. You're using, fossil fuels to generate electricity for the cloud. And people took note, and all the cloud providers now are generating renewable energy for their cloud services, right? So that itself was a big change to go from greenhouse gas reductions, but also renewable energy purchases, right? Mm-hmm. To add to that, now you have sustainable supply chains. The conflict now in Ukraine is bringing bare that problem. COVID brought out all the challenges of supply chain issues. So I think that would be, the next area of focus for large companies is how sustainable are their supply chains. And the second one is in the ESG space and in the carbon space, there are many different scope of emissions. Scope 1 is what you emit. Scope 2 is, what your supply chain emits, and scope 3 is what your consumers emit in terms of carbon and greenhouse gases, right? And so what influence do these large companies have on their consumers? You drive a car or you own a computer. What is the greenhouse gas emissions of you as a customer? And how does the corporation help alleviate that, right? I think answer that question from an Implus point of view. You make footwear. How do you look at that?
Yeah, and Implus is such a unique company because they started off in this footwear space and then expanded to so many avenues of anything from a soccer pop-up goal to different types of high performance socks that you might run if you're an ultra marathoner. All these materials, you're going to have to look at single use versus 10-year, 20-year durability and find where you can have the most influence. Do I need to collect? Do I need to make this compostable? Do I need to look at a more durable version? Do I need to look at 5 different parts that are likely to break down because of user error and consumer engagement? And how do I do this differently? I think if you look at some of the tech companies, some of this outdoor industry, they are doing some things really well in the repair and consumer engagement space to look at how do we take back this phone, this product, and create the things that need to be most repairable so that that phone can be extended or that laptop is extended in terms of life. And you see this with companies like Patagonia, REI, and others that we're in that space as well, looking at how do we make sure this product stays above ground in a useful platform and a useful market stream, and then even at end of life can go into a circular kind of fashion, whether that be fully recycled or made into something else in a productive way.
Absolutely, and there's so many different ways to influence the customer. I think Patagonia is famous for doing their ad on Black Friday that said, why do you want to buy this jacket, this Patagonia jacket? Literally saying, don't buy my jacket, right? I mean, that's pretty strong.
It's pretty genius. I actually had multiple people said that ad was the single thing that made me want to buy 3 more of their jackets. And I mean, it is funny, but if you go on some of these websites now, with the right to repair movement in the United States being so strong, and then also in Europe and other places, we are seeing massive change. And to your point of sending a signal, it's influenced many of the big companies to start saying, okay, I do need to make the repairability. I do need to find better ways to collect. I do need to enable a repair market. And to one of the earlier speakers, that's that future economy we're looking at. Gig workers, people want flexibility. They can work in your companies directly. They can also work in your ecosystem to enable your company and your product. And that's really important to remember. This isn't a zero-sum game between one company and another company. A lot of times they create the market you need.
Right. We'll be remiss if we didn't talk about remote work in this event, because this is a hybrid event. We have some people here, a lot of people online. And I run also a CEO forum, and we met a few months ago. And one of the sessions, breakout sessions we had was remote work. And we had a room of about 40 people crowded talking about remote work. And the irony of that, right? CEOs getting together to talk about remote work. So let's talk about that. The future of work. And here in the audience, just want to take a poll. How many of you in your companies are still working remotely? A show of hands. Okay, so for those of you on live stream, it was 100% here. Everybody's still working remote. Thank you for coming today to this event. Let's talk about that at companies. How do you build culture? Mm-hmm. How do you build the future of your company when you haven't met people you've hired? Most people have hired staff today in the last 2 years without seeing them, meeting them physically. And how do you build a company culture? Because Eric Yuan, the CEO of Zoom, his whole happiness index was he used to tell people before the pandemic, if you're unhappy, don't come to work, right? But today, how do you do that? I mean, what do you do? Say, don't turn on your Zoom video?
Yeah.
I don't know. But
well, I did have something interesting just this last week when my colleague said, I can't handle talking on the phone without a video now because I'm so used to seeing someone's face. And I do think everyone is each their own, and so it does change in how people really have experienced the pandemic, how they've experienced Zoom life and remote life. But I think there's a lot of ways to do this successfully. A lot of the hybrid dynamics are turning into 2-3 days a week, optional days, finding teams that can work in the office on certain days, but not all days. There's a lot of creative ways to do this. And I do think it creates a lot of ownership and empowerment within not just individuals, but also teams. You can create a really unique team environment. It is more intentional though. And I think that's something, there was it a Wall Street Journal article talking about the discomfort that kind of, more mature, established leadership have with this. And it's because of the office structure. They are used to the hierarchy, how things are set up, establishing environments within the corporate space and within that boardroom or that bigger office. And it's going to take flexibility kind of all the way up and all the way down the chain to kind of relearn what this means. But I do think it creates a unique type of opportunity for more workforce to come in and stay.
Yeah. And what we're hearing in the new hybrid model is there'll be teams might get together once in a while, or you come into work once in a while. But I think still the unanswered question is, how do you build a company culture? Mm-hmm. When you're meeting remotely, small teams, how do you disseminate across the entire company? I think that's still a work in progress.
It is, and I think we are seeing it, from the millennial to Gen Zers and so on. There is a little bit of a turnoff from what was, and particularly in Silicon Valley, the free food, the engagement, the parties. The world is turbulent, and particularly younger generations feel that, well, they don't have the same sense of what is stability and reliability in the workplace as a 20-year career might be. They do expect something that they can sink their teeth into. But that can be anything from, regular meetings or regular events that could be, watching a movie remotely, a gaming event. These are things that may not be cross-generational though. And so there's going to be a feeling of distance that is different than what most cultural kind of engagements were in corporate cultures were.
Great. Want to leave a minute or two for any questions? I think I see a question in the audience there. If you could get a mic. Yes, sir.
Thank you, MR. A wonderful conversation. I was reminded of a dinner conversation I had a couple years back when I was talking to this lady, and I'm one of the people who prefer having a physical newspaper in the morning, reading the Wall Street Journal. And I was mentioning it to that lady, and she said, "Gosh, you're wasting trees." And I told her, actually, I recycle these papers, and you read the Wall Street Journal on your phone, and you are wasting more trees because there is a server out there that is consuming electricity so that it can serve that information to you. Now, I was winging it in terms of the sustainability index, but my question to you is, how far are we from having regulatory requirements so that everything has that sustainability index? Just as nutrition is required in all food that we consume, that how far do you think we are from having that sustainability index on everything that we consume?
Yeah, it's a good point. I know in the tech industry, this discussion is already taking place with, like I mentioned, 1 minute of Netflix. What does that mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or consumption of energy and so forth? I think it's a little complicated because it depends on the type of computer, device you're using, the Wi-Fi provider you have, the internet provider you have, the servers that are being used. But these discussions are starting to happen, and people are trying to put a measurement on every ounce of compute power, display of devices, and so on and so forth. Anything to add in that?
Yeah, and I think the whole concept of being able to measure what matters, it's really putting it in terms that then are actionable. So let's say if I were to give you the carbon footprint of Amar's shoes versus mine, would that change me from buying my female boots from
I'd love those. I'd love those.
They're
boots.
wonderful, right? But I think one of the things that we're struggling with is the apples to oranges comparison across so many things and then making it make sense. What does help with carbon footprint is it just puts a number out there for investors to push, governments to push, experts to push, and then consumers, even if they don't know exactly what that means, they're frustrated, they want to know more, and knowing more is half the battle. It's just pushing that envelope. I think some of the spaces where things are happening the most are in those really visionary statements. Google's carbon-free, cloud computing. That's amazing. Just to think about what that really would have to entail to get to that point. I think when you're seeing not just zero plastics, but zero packaging, zero material waste. I do think material labeling and metrics do matter to a point to get to the real goals ultimately. But the slicing and dicing, we are seeing that consumers don't know enough and they get overwhelmed. So they want to avoid like really toxic things, and rather than they know the difference enough to know, is this one better than this one if I have to buy the girl's shoes? So that's kind of, I think, some of the things I'm seeing.
Well, Carrie, we could go on for another hour, but we're out of time, and we want to save everybody's carbon footprint by getting off stage. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today.